I'm John Smolensky. I'm the proprietor of Sovereign Canada. As a company, we do lots of things. We wear many hats. We do a lot of consultation, brand management, importing, and then a lot of educational stuff like this. You're tuning in right now to Spirited Sessions. I know Dave and Alan here have their own unique following. So I'll let you know a little bit what Spirited Sessions is. Spirited Sessions started actually as an idea that took place between Alec Black, who used to be our portfolio ambassador, and I, while we were driving back from Portland Cocktail Week in 2017, and we thought to ourselves, gee, you know, we do all these things. We go to San Antonio Cocktail Conference, Tales of the Cocktail, all these educational seminars, and they're so great. They bring community together, and it's a bit of a town hall, and you know, you get to see each other. But we don't really do much of that stuff in Canada, and we actually don't necessarily make it community specific either. And as a company that represents a whole bunch of independent products, one of the most important things for us to do, obviously, is to put liquid to lips. So we decided to engage on this project, and we would go from market to market across Canada. Fortunately, Canada, you know, there's only 38 million people, so it's not too difficult. You can count all the major markets on two hands. And we'd go from community to community, and once a month, and we'd have a presentation, and we'd invite all the bartenders, and we make cocktails for them and make sure it's free, and we'd have different themes. You know, we do everything from cocktails in private members clubs to why the pineapple has such historical cachet in the hospitality industry to categorical tasting. So this is something I've wanted to do for a while when it comes to rye. I can't think of two better authorities to talk about it than Dave and Alan. Rye has changed so much over the last 20 years. And I think there's a lot of the information that we used to think about rye has either been false or we've been able to expand upon it. And a lot of that has to do with leaders like Dave and Alan and Dale. Of course, I see Dale DeGroff's on the call as well. And going back and doing the work and showing so much passion and so much zeal for the rye whiskey industry. And so we thank you for that. Thank you for bringing this part of the industry forward. And yeah, stay tuned at the end. Dave and Alan have a couple gifts to give away. And the one last thing I'll note is really appreciate your attendance, because what it does mean today is that we are able to pledge some money to EGAL Canada, which is a support network for the LGBTQ+ community in Canada, the Black Health Alliance, and the Native Women's Association of Canada. And so together, alongside Corby's Pernod Ricard Canada, we'll be donating $10 to each of those charities. And that happens because of your attendance today. So we really, really appreciate it. So without further ado, I'll let Dave and Alan introduce themselves, and we'll get going. Make sure you're on speaker view as well, so you can actually see what's happening. And thanks again. We should be about, as I said, we should be about 60 minutes. Take it away, gents.
Alan, you go ahead.
Well, that's too kind of you, Dave. I figured we'd go alphabetical, but thank you, Dave. John, thanks for including me and inviting me. It's always a pleasure for me to get to talk about rye whiskey, and I'll try and keep my remarks as succinct as possible, just to give my very quick background. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland in the 70s and 80s, and from a family that had primarily been in Baltimore since the late 1800s. My grandmother's family, which had immigrated one side from Russia, the other from Lithuania, started the first commercial bakery in Baltimore City back in the late 19th century. The family never had a car, even into, middle-class families, have a TV, have a car. They ultimately delivered by truck, but my grandmother, in the early part of the 20th century, up until the time she was in her 20s and then got another job, would deliver bread by horse and buggy. And the other side of my family had been in Baltimore for about the same time frame. And it was really a great influence of my grandmothers. They were very different people. They were very different drinkers. neither of them had a lot of their own teeth. That's another story for another time. But they enjoyed taking me around Baltimore City when I was a kid and when I was a teenager. And there were some landmark places, and I'll just reference one because it was so instrumental in becoming an aficionado and ultimately a rye whiskey distiller in New York. And that was the Lord Baltimore Hotel, which was an historic hotel. It's still there in downtown Baltimore. And there was a famous room there, the John Eager Howard Room. And when I was 17, I started going there with my grandmother, and it was just an occurrence to go out. She was a very social creature. She had been a widow most of the life that I knew her, but she was still very social and just enjoyed being out in public and sharing experiences with me. And it was the first time I ever had a Manhattan that I can certainly remember. So 17 years old. And for those that may not be aware, the historic brand Pikesville Rye. Pikesville is actually a smallish suburb of Baltimore City, which is where I spent most of my childhood. So even though at that point in time, it was no longer made in Maryland proper or in West Virginia or other parts from a contract distilling standpoint, the brand had moved down to Kentucky, as many American rye whiskeys brands did. It was very enthusiastic. It was very alerting to me that Pikesville Rye would be on a shelf somewhere. And I very much enjoyed it. I just liked the cocktail. I liked hanging out with my grandmother. I didn't know a thing about the whiskey, the mash bill. It just said the name of my hometown on it. And it was very, several years after that, when I moved to New York, which I'd wanted to do since I was 12 years old, that I said, well, how come I only see Pikesville Rye when I'm in Baltimore? And it was increasingly as I got into the spirits industry and the cocktail aspects of that I became familiar with the brand, and that most of the historic American rye whiskeys really were no longer made at the points of their origin, but that had been scooped up, collected. There are many different opinions. I have my own. I don't really think Prohibition killed American rye whiskey. I think it was really later into the World War II era and has a lot to do with our taste buds and a lot, even more so, to do with marketing. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But it was really that occurrence to say, wow, all of these rye whiskeys have been collected. I'll make a profound statement, and say none of them were their original mash bill. Not that that matters entirely, except that there was no historical link, except for the names of the brands, to those brands that had become part of my heritage. I felt that Maryland being such a profound, at the time, agricultural state, going back to the 1600s, 1700s, and then learning a little bit from the standpoint of agronomy, what might be an interesting climate and soil composition for rye to thrive in. That's also another story for another day, where my parents at one point almost bought a small winery, and instead of doing that, one grandma came to live with us, and that took all the funds, and the winery never happened. I could have been making wine, but here I am making rye whiskey. But those are some snippets for me. And then it was really, in the late 90s and the early aughties that I was just very, very honestly in the right place at the right time. For those that have been to New York City, and I'd say if you want today, collectively we can hold hands, or please do it later. Say a prayer for this city. It is semi-apocalyptic right now, and I will hold back tears, and I'm not joking, because our industry is decimated. And the places that were so critical to me and influential on me, most will be gone. It's just the way it is. And I can't complain. It's just factual right now that the bar industry in our country here south of you, and certainly in New York City, feels like it almost by necessity is going to be sacrificed. And I separate the bar industry from the restaurant industry to a degree. But there's just no way to congregate safely, and I don't know when that will happen. But in those late 90s and early aughties, when I lived in the East Village, Dale's on so he can correct me, and there's always a few to add, but to me, there were three cocktail bars plus the Rainbow Room. But the three cocktail bars that I could walk to, starting New Year's Eve, December 1999, Milk and Honey opened on Eldridge Street, which is now Attaboy, 134 Eldridge. There was Angel Share, which I haven't read any details about, but I hope will still be there post all of this commotion. And there was a great bar in the West Village, Chelsea area called Passerby, owned by Toby Cicchini, who has got many lives of fame and acclaim, is now the owner of Long Island Bar, not on Long Island, but in the Brooklyn Heights section of Brooklyn. And going to these bars, you could just feel that there was this cultural moment of a reclamation of what we felt, very honestly, was some part of American gastronomy that was out there that was just not so tangible. And I'll wrap it up here so Dave can get on and get me off of this storytelling time. But for me, that moment, including 2 trips to the Rainbow Room, one when I didn't live in New York and one when I was in the East Village, you could just sense that there was this moderate creep, that we were yearning for things to call our own. Wine culture is not inherently American. Food culture, we got barbecue of the American South. That is authentic American gastronomy. There's not much else. But that somehow this elevation of cocktail culture over several years in the 80s, 90s, and then afoot in the aughties with all the cocktail bars that opened was really the launching off point for me and many, many others, of course, of saying, wow, what are all these recipes that allude to rye whiskey? What is this effort? And I've got one picture of it in a little presentation I'll give of the George Washington distillery at Mount Vernon, his estate, literally his plantation on the Potomac River in Virginia, where he had a 5-still distillery and became the largest commercial producer of rye whiskey in the United States at that time. This is not long after the American Revolutionary War. And so it swept me up in many ways. One, because it felt like smaller fish in the bigger pond of American whiskey, obviously including bourbon, but also global whiskey, but that there also could be a sense of diversity in one sense of style of whiskey, but also a reclamation project to reintroduce what in my mind became an authentic style of American rye whiskey.
You're going to have to follow that one up, Dave. But thank you, Alan, so much for sharing and being transparent. I know it's really, really hard, and you know, it's sometimes it's not real until you see it around you. So so thank you for sharing with us. Who is Dave Mitton?
I can't follow that. That was very
I get
impressive.
excited, bro.
Yeah.
I think first off, I just want to say, those tuning in might not realize this, but you and Alan came up with the idea this was going to be a seminar at Toronto Cocktail Conference in a couple of weeks. We were all going to be together with a live audience and having drinks afterwards. So thanks for setting this up and putting this together today. Hopefully next August we can all be together again and do something similar. But I'm Dave Mitton. My title is Global Brand Ambassador for Canadian Whiskies through Corby Spirit and Wine, which those not calling from Canada would be Pernod Ricard Canada, essentially. Grew up in the Maritimes, East Coast Canada, and New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, right next to Maine and Vermont. After high school, I decided I wanted to spend some time traveling and see the world, and managed to do that for several years, kind of backpacking, but worked in bars and restaurants along the way. And that's where I found my love for the industry and spirits and beer and wine and everything that comes with it. And found myself in Toronto, Canada, probably early 2000s, found myself working a bar, fell in love with the city. It took a while. The big city and a bit of a cold city. In 2 different ways, it's a cold city. And found myself opening up a few different bars and restaurants. First one was Chahosky, an old butcher shop from the 1920s that had been closed for decades. And We took 2.5 years, a couple of guys in their early 20s, and rebuilt the 3 floors by hand. And I had started looking up into old books because I wanted to do cocktails from the 1920s. People in Toronto weren't doing cocktails back then. I mean, you might get a Stoli raspberry and soda. That was a cocktail back in 2001 in Toronto. By the time we got the doors open in 2005, I'd managed to put together a little cocktail list that from the times of the 1920s suited the place. And the only problem with it was the city of Toronto was not ready for it yet. People would order a Manhattan or a Bucade or a Diamondback, and they would send it back saying, buddy, that is just straight alcohol. So we had to go back to maybe muddling fruits. I would have grabbed some of Dale's books to see some cocktails, or and we started using fresh juices back then and muddling fruits, which we weren't doing at the time. Forward on to 2007, and I opened a little place called the Harvard Room. And that was when cocktail culture was finally hitting Canada, I'd say in Vancouver and Toronto for sure, and started working with a lot of whiskeys. My attention came down to whiskeys, and it was 2012. We had gotten a bit of attention nationally and internationally as the cocktail scenes went. Someone came to me one day, a sales rep from Corby, Pernod Ricard, and they brought in this bottle of this little Lot 40. And I was like, what the hell is that? And they said, it's a Canadian Rye whiskey. And I tried it, and I said, that's not a Canadian whiskey. Canadian whiskey is majority double column distilled light corn with like a pinch of rye added to it. That's what Canadian whiskey is. And then they explained to me that it was 100% rye whiskey, column pot distilled, aged in new American oak. Needless to say, I sold enough of that whiskey over the next 2 years. The company came to me and offered me a job to be the face of this brand. And that has grown over the last 6 years, where we were sold in Canada. We are now sold in close to 22 countries across the globe. And it's done quite well for itself. And that's how I got here. That's how I'm here today.
Well, I love it. I love it. Thanks for sharing. It's always nice to hear those stories. It's always different every time you tell them too. Cool. Well, let's talk about rye. That's why we're here, right? Let's get into it a little bit, shall we?
All right. Let me see if I can share this screen that we use. Hold on here.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the Toronto Cocktail Conference stuff. Yeah, I was really looking forward to this, because I think what's happening with rye right now is so interesting. All these different categories, and as Alan said before, reclamation projects. Yeah, hopefully we get to do it next year. But yeah, get into it, Dave.
Yeah. All right. So I figured I'm not going to take too long, because these presentations can go on forever, but I'm going to talk a little history, whiskey barons, and process, and we'll let Alan take over, and we'll come back together. Canadian whiskey. It's sold in 160 countries around the world. I think everyone knows it. I think everyone knows Canadian whiskey the same way they know Canadians. Soft and sweet, but they don't know much about us. I think Canadian whiskey might be the world's most misunderstood spirit category, to be honest. 10 years ago, if you asked a bartender about mezcal, they would have looked at you like you were crazy. Now, I'd say Canadian whiskey, most people don't know much about it. 4 dates I always like to talk about, pardon me, 5. Well, there was certainly some outside influence in the birth of Canadian whiskey. Really, it was a result of the natural progression with which people settled into this country. In short, it was resourceful. People are always looking to make most of what they've got. I mean, for instance, here in Ontario, settlers found an abundance of grain and plenty of fresh water, and that's kind of how the whiskey came to be. So if you look at the deck here, first date would be 1762 to 1850. That was the Scottish immigrants made their way to Canada from the Highland clearances, where rich landlords were pushing people out of their homes, and they made their way overseas. Same way as a lot of the Irish made their way to the US. A lot of the Scottish made their way to where I grew up, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. I mean, even to the point, if you look at the spelling of our whiskey, Scotland has no E in the whiskey, and neither does Canadian whiskey. Next date would be 1776. You're probably thinking, sorry. And when the Scottish made their way over, a lot of them brought their distilling techniques with them because we were just eating grain at that point. So they started teaching us how to make whiskey. The next date would be 1776. You're probably thinking, what the hell does the Declaration of Independence have to do with making Canadian whiskey? Now, this story doesn't go over as well when I'm in London, but America was at war with the British, and America won the war. But where do you think the British loyalists headed after they lost to the Americans? They headed north. They went to the hills of Kentucky and New York and Pennsylvania, Ohio, and they headed to Canada. We weren't even a country yet, but they just headed across the border. And like the Scottish, they brought their distilling techniques with them as well. Some of them came by horse and buggy and carriage and brought little pot stills with them. Essentially, you've got the Scottish and the English coming to Canada, and they're teaching us to make moonshine, I guess is a good way to put it. Your next date would be 1789 to 1815. Now, that was the beginning of the French Revolution, right up to the ending of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, during that time, brandy was the main spirit of in England, and when they ran out of it, I mean, they consumed it all. You can see on the deck, they started looking towards more North American whiskeys, and at that point, that was kind of when North American whiskeys started making their ways overseas. Fourth date would be, generally most people always assume Canadian whiskey made its way into the US during Prohibition. And I was recently somewhere overseas and they said, why does it matter if your product makes it into the US? And I said, well, right currently there's close to 400 million people living there. If your product or brand or category can do well in that country, you're doing pretty good altogether. And Canadian whiskey, a lot of it does sell in the US. Now, Prohibition actually almost killed the Canadian whiskey category, American Prohibition. We'll get into that in a minute. But what brought Canadian whiskey into the US was American Civil War from 1861 to 65. And it makes sense when you think of it. Where was most whiskey made back then in the US? Down in the South. People stopped making whiskey to fight. People weren't selling any of the whiskey to the northern states. So the northern states looked a little more north, up to Canada, and asked if they could buy some whiskey from us, and we were happy to oblige. They were using it, that was medication on the field, medication back then. It was a brutal war, and Canadian whiskey made its way in. It was at this point, it was a very soft, light whiskey. And when a lot of people were used to moonshine, this was welcomed with open arms and became one of the #1 selling spirit categories in the US. Next slide. If I can work this. Fifth date, Canadian creativity. You look at these dates here, 1887, Canada mandated a 1-year aging law. 1890, Canada moved to a 2-year minimum. In 1974, it moved up to a 3-year minimum age statement, and that's the current regulation. I don't foresee it changing anytime soon. Now, if you imagine back then, say we were making moonshine essentially, and barrels at the time were used more for transportation than anything else. There were no forklifts, and people would bring little barrels to the distillery and they'd have it filled up to bring home for home consumption. But they'd also use these barrels for storage. If you drank your whiskey out of the barrel, maybe you'd keep that barrel to store some pelts or fish or pickles, something of the time. And imagine if you've eaten all of that fish with your family and you decide you want to take the barrel back to the grocery and grog or the distillery and have it filled up. That's not going to taste really nice. So the idea to burn out the nasty flavors into the barrels comes along. You put the whiskey into that charred barrel, and we all know what happens. You get the beautiful amber colors, notes of vanilla, toffee, caramel. Now comes a higher quality whiskey. Doesn't that sound romantic? I'd like to tell you that was the exact reason why whiskey makers were doing that, but that is not a case. It was a tax grab. the fact that we had to mandate an aging law of 2 years in 1890 to be called a Canadian whiskey. We have the founder of our distillery in a newspaper article saying he would have never got into making whiskey if he would have known that he had to sit on his product to make a profit for 2 years. This shut down a lot of distilleries in Canada. I mean, we look at micro distilleries across Canada and the US opening up all the time now. What are the first two things they put out? Gin, vodka, because they've got to pay the bills. So a lot of people couldn't pay their bills when they had to sit on their product for 2 years. That's a little bit of the Canadian aging laws. And then American Prohibition, I brought it up a little earlier. Most people think, because of all the wonderful TV shows and movies we saw, that American Prohibition was a savior for Canadian whiskey. Couldn't be farther than the truth. Now, yes, the little stories and TV shows and movies we see happen on a really small scale. Canadian whiskey did make its way down from Harry Hatch to Al Capone, small scale. What would have made more sense back then? To make your own whiskey and sell it in the US, have your cousin down the road with their still make you some whiskey instead of bringing it across an international border? Most certainly. Now, our distillery is in Windsor, most southerly tip of Canada, right across from Detroit. And when you go to Detroit, there are certainly some bars where in the basements have been dug out and old barrels were kept. It's pretty cool to see. But American Prohibition really hurt the category of Canadian whiskey. And that too shut down a lot of distilleries. There would have been over 200 distilleries in Canada at the beginning of American Prohibition. At the end of American Prohibition, there would have been under 10 distilleries functioning. So it really did hurt the category. Now, when American Prohibition was over, yes, we were there. We were ready to come back in and sell whiskey, and we were so happy the US was willing to take us on, and still happy to be there today. Next, I know these guys look like a bunch of bartenders from Brooklyn or Toronto, but these are actually some of the first Canadian whiskey barons. These gentlemen had a lot to do with the way Canadian whiskey is made today. You're looking at William Gooderham and James Worts, Gooderham and Worts Distillery. You're looking at Henry Corby, from all three men from the UK. Henry Corby being the founder of our company. Hiram Walker from Boston lived in Detroit as a grocer and traveled across the river every day to build Hiram Walker and Sons Distillery, our current distillery in Windsor. And then you get this guy, J.P. Weiser, who was a New Yorker who took advantage of Civil War and Prohibition. The guy moved to Prescott, Ontario and opened up a distillery in Canada. And he was one of the first people at the Chicago World Fair to have bottled, labeled whiskey to show off and sell around the world. Pretty cool guys. I mean, a little history on them. Gooderham and Worts moved from the UK, and in the town of York, which is now downtown Toronto, opened up a distillery. They were grain millers. And they opened up what was the largest distillery in the world in 1877. Now is a tourist attraction. The distillery district in downtown Toronto is literally the old Gooderham and Worts distillery. A lot of American movies filmed there because it still looks like 1832 when you walk around. The only difference now is inside it's little cafes, bars, stores to buy your dog clothes, real tourist attraction. It's gorgeous. They had a lot to do with the way Canadian whiskey is made today. They were the gentlemen who came up with double column distillation, which we'll talk about after. Hiram Walker, little image there. Let's say he was the first commuter from US to Canada on a daily basis. He ended up buying, how many acres was it? He bought 460 acres he bought in 1834 for 1,300 British pounds. And that is where he started building Hiram Walker, where our whiskeys are made today. And it is one of the largest distilleries in North America, actually. It's a pretty impressive sight to behold. It is a massive factory that puts out some beautiful brands. And then you got Henry Corby, who was a baker from England, moved to Canada and started a distillery, which it grew to Corbyville. He built a community around him. And John Philip Weiser built a name for himself. He was a businessman before a distiller. He was a cattle breeder. He had ranches in Florida, Texas, Ontario. He had the largest head of cattle in North America and was the first man to sell his cattle to the UK. He was doing something people weren't back then. We have some of his old notebooks. He bought his distillery in Prescott, Ontario to make whiskey, but he wanted the spent grain to feed his cattle. And his cattle at the time were some of the largest in North America, and no one knew why, but he was feeding that spent grain full of fats and proteins and growing them larger than most cattle. He was a smart guy. Little tidbits on our distillery. I was saying it's one of the largest in North America. Process 100,000 metric tons of corn per year, and then 10,000 metric tons of rye, 10,000 metric tons of barley, and 10,000 metric tons of wheat every year. We've got 19 grain silos that hold 750 metric tons of each grain. Pretty impressive site of 39 fermentation tanks, 4 stories high, 40,000 gallons of spirit per day, 2 column stills, 5 stories high. We put in 1,300 barrels into our drain and fill daily on an 8-hour basis. 16 warehouses that have 1.6 million barrels at any given time. And we bottle 5 million cases a year. Now, please keep in mind, our Canadian whiskeys are probably about 1 million of those 5 million cases. It's quite obvious we make a lot of product for other companies, other Canadian whiskeys, some American whiskeys. You know what? We make Malibu rum for North and South America. So when you're on a whiskey tour, we walk to one section and everyone says, "Why do I smell suntan lotion?" I'm like, they're making Malibu today. So it's a pretty, like I said, it's a pretty impressive sight to behold. It's not a romantic walk through Ireland and Scotland. It is a factory, but it takes about 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. to do the entire tour in your blending course with Dr. Don Livermore. What's next here? Oh yeah, what is Canadian whiskey? Alan would be able to tell me. Now, I believe in the US, there's probably about 39 categories of whiskey. In Canada, we have 2. We have Canadian whiskey and we have flavored Canadian whiskey. Canadian whiskey, rules are pretty simple. Very similar to Irish, actually. We have to use cereal grain. We use rye, corn, wheat, and barley. Cereal mash production has to take place in Canada. So does distillation. So does aging. Now, in Canada, we keep the grains separate. So all of the corn, rye, wheat, and barley, they are fermented separately. They're distilled separately, distilled in different ways, aged separately, aged in different types of casks for different amounts of time. And this is why we have a master blender in Canada. Our master blender is Dr. Don Livermore. If you've not met Dr. Don, I see Lou Bryson's on here too. I know him and Dr. Don are pretty good buddies. Dr. Don's got his master's degree in microbiology. That was before he got his PhD in brewing and distilling out of Harriet Watt. So if you want to talk to someone about what wood does to whiskey, he can keep you occupied for about 3 hours. Very interesting man, and he's been a great mentor to me over the last 6 years to have at my side. Speaking of wood, it's got to be aged in small wooden barrels under 700 liters for a minimum of 3 years. So that's the youngest we'll usually put out is about 5 years, and the oldest we currently have out is 35 years. Must be bottled a minimum 40 ABV, and we, like most whiskeys, can contain spirit caramel for color. People hear caramel and they think flavor. It's not flavor, it's just color. Keep consistency. And one thing we can do that throws people off, a lot of people will say, "Oh, Canadian whiskey, you can throw tea in there, vodka, whatever you want." Well, that's just not right. That's false. That's bad writing. That's false misinformation.
Fake news.
It's illegal to put neutral grain spirit or vodka into a Canadian whiskey. I've heard, I work in the US 80% of the year. I know that's where a lot of confusion goes. A lot of people think Canadian whiskey or blended Scotch, because it says blended, can have a neutral grain spirit. That is not the case. However, though, 9.09 of an aged spirit can be blended into a Canadian whiskey. This was made up by the original whiskey barons back in the late 1800s. Some Canadian whiskey producers do take advantage of this. We do in some of our brands. Not in Lot 40, we do not in our craft series. I couldn't imagine anyone would ever put 9% into something, but I mean, you might put 0.5% of a sherry into something like our JP Weiser's 15-year-old. Pretty interesting. You can do a lot of things with it. Quick story. I asked Don once if he ever found old lost barrels out of the 1.6 million barrels. And he said, no, we're a distillery. We get audited. Everybody gets audited. People don't lose barrels. That's marketing. All right. Takes a little bit of the romance out. But fine, Dr. Don. And he said, for instance, I have barrels left over to me that I have to figure out what to do. Like what? I said, for instance, I have 18 barrels of a 50-year-old Scotch. I said, why would we have 18 barrels of a 50-year-old Scotch at our distillery? 50 years ago, they were probably using it to blend in the 9.09 rule. Of course. What are you going to do with it? I don't know yet. 2 years later, he approaches me and says, hey, remember that Scotch? I went, oh yeah, what happened with that? He took it to drain and fill and got one full barrel out of the 18 barrels. 3% Angel Sherry year, 17 barrels the Angels drank in 52 years. So he had now had one barrel of a 52-year-old Scotch. Long story short, because it's a longer story, he ended up taking a 15-year-old corn whiskey that had been aged in New American oak, stunning whiskey on its own, and he blended 4% of this 52-year-old Scotch into that. And marketing got a hold of it, and it called it JP Weiser's Union 52, the Union of Scotland and Canada, teaching us how to make whiskey with a 52-year-old peated Scotch. It was stunning, sold out overnight. That's a great example of where you can have a lot of fun with the 9.09 rule. Whoops, we're going to come back to that. Right now, I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to let Alan take over.
Yeah, I figured we said 45 to 60 minutes. I know that was going to go a little longer with how loquacious the three of us are. Yeah, that's great to see a little perspective on Canadian whiskey and how Rye is implemented. Just hand it over now to Alan, and I think Evan, you're gonna share some slides here as well. So Alan, just yell slide, and Evan's gonna click it over. And yeah, I just threw, while we're just waiting for a second, I'll just throw in the chat. It's the reason, a lot of people don't know this, but the reason why it's 9.09% is because it's 1 part aged spirit for every 10 parts Canadian whiskey. So it's not some sort of weird number. If you do the math, it makes a lot more sense.
Apologies, I was rambling over myself there.
Yeah. Go for it, Evan.
So for me, and Dave, thank you, because that allows me to explain things from the standpoint of a platform of Canadian whiskey and Canadian Rye whiskey. And there's some specific differences that are really just stylistic, and maybe we just like rules and regulations by history. For American Rye whiskey, to just sort of set it up as a parallel and get it out of the way to some regard, because this would be a lot more fun if we could taste a range of whiskeys together. But American Rye whiskey simply is a rye mash bill. It has to be at least 51% rye by law, minimum 51% rye, that cannot exceed at its point of distillation 80% ABV, so 160 proof. And this was lost on me in our first runs, if you ever come down to Brooklyn, but you cannot have a barrel entry point greater than 125 proof. A little known secret is maybe about the first 10 barrels might have gone in at 135 proof. Shit happens. But everything else has gone in at 125 proof. And interestingly, you know, if you ever are interested from an American perspective, it's a resource I use all the time. You can just simply Google TTB, that's the United States Tax and Trade Bureau, TTB Chapter 4, and you will get the laundry list of every spirit and liqueur that is legally sold in this country and its associated definition. The definition for rye whiskey is probably about that big, the entirety of this space. So the last part, has to be a mash bill of at least 51% rye. Rye from wherever. Can't be distilled over 80% ABV. Barrel entry proof no greater than 125. And it has to be aged in a charred new oak, quote unquote, vessel. So it doesn't say barrel. I guess you could build a box if you wanted to, but it has to be aged in a charred new oak vessel. So some interesting differences, obviously, in mash bill. Doesn't say what type of still it has to be. Doesn't say how long it has to be aged. The first jokes I ever got when I went down to Kentucky is, how long is bourbon or rye in those parallels have to be aged? And they would say 15 minutes or 15 feet. Roll that barrel down the hill. You can call it rye whiskey. To be a straight rye whiskey in American lingo is, well, it's a good quote. I live by it every day. You can keep going there, Evan.
Okay.
To be a straight rye whiskey is a minimum of 2 years, and there's different designations after that, of course. And these are just some figures. I'm not going to read them. You can see them as I talk. It just brings me great enthusiasm from 17 years old to 49, which I am this month, for how rye whiskey has grown in about 10, 11 years. Continues to have an international association with American cocktail culture, but also global whiskey culture. Do we lose that?
Yeah, I'm having some technical difficulties. John,
okay.
Do you have yours up here? Because mine's not letting me share it.
It's okay. I can speak to it as well. For me, as I was saying in my first remarks, that this is one of the labels from the Mount Vernon distillery, which was, if you notice at the bottom, which is a family link as well, that ultimately, in a very American sensibility, the people that took over at Mount Vernon sold the name. And if you can see this old advertisement, at the bottom of the label for the whiskey, it says Hannes Distilling Company. The Hannes Distilling Company took over as the contract distiller, where ultimately Mount Vernon became defunct. And they had distilleries in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Martinsburg, West Virginia, where my family somehow settled. And thank God I didn't grow up there. But, it's a tiny little town over the Maryland border into West Virginia. It has its charm, but there's no city action. But Hannes, Mr. Hannes, who my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather knew that family, as I like to say, my father could see the Hannes Distillery, which looks like something out of the imagery that Dave presented, like the distillery in York, that would have been the Hannes Distillery churning out rye whiskey. You can keep going, Evan. For comparison's sake, where Dave, I believe, said this is the Hannes, the rebuilt Mount Vernon Distillery, George Washington's distillery. For comparison's sake, the distillery that I own, New York Distilling Company in Brooklyn, is more modest in scale even than this rebuilt distillery to spec that George Washington created with his foreman, who was Scottish. And Dave, I believe you said you're filling 1,300 barrels a day?
Correct, yeah. Draining and filling 1,300.
Draining and filling 1,300 barrels a day. Yeah. Our greatest objective has been to fill 1,000 barrels, 53-gallon, 205 liter barrels in a year. We've never hit that target. We're trying. The most I think we filled in a year was about 867. Our first year, which was this fall, will be 9 autumns ago, we filled 26 barrels. And it was important simply that we were going to make our own whiskey, learn about our own whiskey, and discover it along with everyone else, so that we could explain it as well as we could and be blenders just the same. So it's a small scale in the creep of growth as it can be. And at this point, 8.5 years in, we're sitting on a few thousand barrels, and we keep a few in Brooklyn, but most we keep in warehouses upstate. But it really allows us, in a very patient manner, to almost know each barrel. I don't know each barrel. We don't have names for each barrel, but we know them by the most minuscule microsections of these warehouses to see if there's a repetition of notes of aroma, flavor. Our barrels go 10 high at its maximum. But even in that, there's a wide spread of heat distribution if you're by an exterior wall compared to an interior wall. But again, just to give you that context, the most we filled is about 850. The differences here, is a fun slide, but it really is about the tradition of American whiskey and that we mix all the grains together. Frankly, in COVID land, I've been making a lot of pizza. And so I've been experimenting with different flours to make dough. And I simply use that analogy, whether it's Italian flour, all-purpose white flour, rye flour, which I have a lot of. And we mix it in advance, just like we would do a mash bill or a recipe, and distill the grains together. I'm not sure there's a necessity. It's not a comparative point to me that says one is so distinctive than the other. It does come down after the fact to a concerted blending process. But it was interesting at its point of origin, since it's really not that long ago, that what we tried to do, since we knew we would be blending grains together, was to look at what would be a point of pushing the envelope on a rye characteristic without going overboard. In other words, in very plain speak, how could we work to achieve a rye whiskey, in my mind at least, that could be used in a cocktail, a wide variety of whiskey cocktails, but that you could also reasonably sip neat, or probably more exactingly on an ice cube or two. And so that's how we really derived at a mash bill in its origins that was 72% rye. Right now, our concerted mash bill is 75% rye, 13% malted barley, 13% corn, 12% malted barley. And so I'll get into the grains a little bit. You can keep going, Evan. And this is where I look at, at one point in time, these were exceedingly popular. Who knew there was an Old Crow rye? Well, surely there's Old Crow bourbon, a brand that still exists under the Beam name. But once upon a time, there was this magnificent celebration of rye whiskey as an American whiskey, as an American spirit. And Dave really alluded to it in some of his imagery and what he spoke about, in that, Prohibition, American Prohibition, took a couple of pecks maybe out of American rye whiskey. But for me, in one being from Baltimore and doing some concerted research there, not just library research, but even research at Johns Hopkins Medical Library in terms of usages of rye whiskey, of rock and rye, and how the pattern of usage of rye whiskey over decades was really supported until post-Prohibition, because that's when you really had titanic efforts to market bourbon in our country. Maybe it was beyond our country too, but certainly in the glossy magazines, and not just food magazines, but all types of culture magazines, bourbon came out as the genteel or gentleman spirit. Oh, you're going to a white-jacketed or more sophisticated affair, have a bourbon. Rye whiskey and its concluded demeanor for, to be very honest, men from Maryland, blue-collar steelworkers, Pennsylvania, blue-collar coal miners, not so genteel, hairy-knuckled union guys drinking rye whiskey out of New York. And they really worked to create this diametrically opposed image of the rye whiskey drinker to the softer, more sophisticated bourbon drinker. And that, along with some very specific decisions induced by panic from Maryland and Pennsylvania rye distillers, to me is really what started putting nails in the coffin in its origins of some of these original marks of American rye whiskey. And so I always love this because I think of Old Crow as bourbon too, but here we are, as a contract brand, Old Crow Rye. You can keep going.
Oh, there you go.
This is one of our rye fields, and I always like to put Rick in any imagery that I share. This is Rick Peterson. You can keep going through these. This is rye from last year, growing through the seasons. This is rye probably in springtime. Rye harvest here is just like it is there. We're so close to Canada that it's basically on the same seasonality. Our rye was harvested just a few weeks ago in the early to mid part of July. We'll wait for the corn harvest coming up in September, and then we'll start working on mashing and distilling. You can keep going. Mashing and distilling come the latter part of the fall. On the left is our distillery in Brooklyn. This is our still. It's a 1,000-liter kettle. So our first 2 years, it was just on this still, which is why I referenced our first year, about 26 barrels. On the right is a facility that we built with Black Dirt Distillery in Orange County, New York, which is about a 90-minute drive from New York City. It's a 40-foot column still, and it's really what allowed us to start in our scale, churning out barrels of rye whiskey. And you can see in the background, this is more pastoral, on the right side, of course, that's allowed us to put up, otherwise, whiskey rick houses that could house several thousand barrels at a time and allow us to grow into this space, but to put more barrels down concertedly. Go ahead, Evan, and start to take real note of what's going on in the barrel. Just another great image, different styles of whiskey. We'll keep going here. I just put, some of the sample range of what's coming out that maybe is a little bit lesser known. One, Old Overholt's got their bonded or bottled in bond whiskey. Redemption Rye is a 100% contract rye whiskey, and they make no bones about it. It's a distillate from Indiana and traditional mash bills. Old Overholt is a 200-plus-year-old brand from Pennsylvania that is a 52% rye mash bill today. Surely in its origins, it was far greater percentage mash bill than that. Sagamore is a newish distillery in Baltimore, Maryland, that right now is sourcing whiskey in Indiana. Redemption and Sagamore both from MGP, but they're also distilling their own, and maybe they're a year away or so from finally putting out their own whiskey. And interesting that this is a blend of two different mash bills. They're taking, and it's because this is what MGP offers, a 95% rye mash bill and a 52% rye mash bill. And their unique story is that they mix them together. It is ultimately going to be rye made in Maryland, this historic seat of American rye whiskey, but it doesn't have a specific relationship to Maryland rye whiskey of the 18th or even late 17th century. And then Ragtime there, of course, is ours, and I've told you the mash bill. And then interestingly as well, Whistle Pig, and I put a picture of the farm stock because, for me and where I sit, Whistle Pig is really what in many ways put Canadian rye whiskey back into our brains here in New York, because so much of it in its origins has been sourced, extraordinary rye whiskey sourced from Canada. So we continue to be just sort of frenetic energy about rye whiskey here, and we each pick our own point of view. Again, I describe mine as trying to come up with a whiskey. If I was to give it a marketing tagline, it would simply be a new American whiskey that tastes of more than just wood, period. Keep going on. So these are American New York prices, but I thought this would be interesting too, just to give context. I know, $30 US is about $40 Canadian, and $40 US is probably $54 Canadian. But just to give some context of the range that we look at of what I would call sort of in the craft range of distilleries, of rye whiskeys. And it doesn't all mean they're from small distilleries. It just means they're being purposefully made with a specific outlook of product. And if anybody's interested, you can email me and I can send you any of this and other information about what's happening with rye whiskey down here. So, here we go. One more, sort of toward the end here, and I just like this because of the proximity to Dave's distillery and the Detroit Tigers and the popularity. And I wish in many ways, if I was to regress somehow to another point in time historically, the upper Midwest and the cities of Michigan and others, and Illinois, I think would have been fascinating places to be in a positive toggle, not just American rye whiskey and Canadian rye whiskey, but being able to compare these styles and others at the same time when they both had, real significant influence at the same time. So the last thing I really wanted to share with you, because I think, from Dave's perspective and my perspective, we're also, and Dr. Don's perspective, working on the future of rye whiskey. And this is a fun project that I've been working on in collaboration, not just with our distillery, New York Distilling Company, but with several other distilleries in New York State, is a moniker called Empire Rye, New York, of course, being the Empire State. And we've taken classic examples of the rules and regulations from our federal government and just modified them a little bit. What's unique about our distilling operation is that we have technically a Class D or farm distiller's license. We are not farmers. I'm not good at farming or even gardening, but as I showed you intentionally, that photo of Rick, our farmer, all of our rye is sourced from Rick. Our first year was probably about 30,000 pounds of rye, and probably our biggest year was also 800, 900,000 pounds of rye. But Rick, who's the largest organic farmer of organic cabbage in upstate New York, is flexible with the fields that he has, that have, as we've had interest in growing other varieties of rye and increasing our output, he's been able to grow with us. So to have this distilling license in New York, you have to have one product at least that has a minimum of 75% New York State agriculture in the final product. Of course, all of our whiskeys have at least 75% New York State agriculture. And so as we worked in a group to set these rules and regulations, 75 became the key number. And that's frankly why we raised our mash bill from 72 to 75, but that an Empire Rye must be 75% New York State grown rye. It must be aged for a minimum of 2 years in charred barrels. And I acquiesced on that. Our minimum age for anything that we put out under the Ragtime Rye label or other whiskey labels that we have is a minimum of 3 years. Ragtime Rye right now is a blend of 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-old rye. And our bottled and bond variety is a straight on 4-year-old rye. If you're getting it at this point, it's probably spring of 2015 rye is probably what's out in the marketplace now. So we wanted to be as inclusive as possible. And again, even though that there were 6, 7 distilleries that put these principles together in origin, I would bet, again, God willing, everybody holds on from their business life standpoint, that by the end of, I'll add a year, by the end of 2021, I would bet there'll be almost 20 New York State distilleries producing Empire Ryes. You'll also notice that we put a specific rule in regarding barrel entry proof, where the American limit is 125. We lowered that to 115. One, from an historic stance, going back to the 18th century styles of rye whiskey, but also thinking that we could really differentiate this and that it might take another decades or more time, but to see if there isn't some kind of resolute quality amongst Empire Ryes that perhaps could also be attributed to a lower barrel entry proof. And the last but not least is obvious that it has to be mashed, fermented, distilled, barreled, and aged at a single New York distillery. And that was important for us because, damn it, we've invested all the time and money into putting this business together. So you can't buy barrels from someone else and call it an Empire Rye. Similar to a bottled and bond fashion, you have to actually own the distillery to have the output and be able to label it as such. So those are the tenets of Empire Rye, and we're really very excited about it because it labels something to me uniquely that could possibly be a New York style of American whiskey. Time will tell. That's a little fuller view. That's about what we keep on hand. Frankly, there's maybe 2 rows at the distillery now, but as an urban distillery, our department's always looking at new regulations for safety, which they should. So better to keep them away from things like this, but just so you have a fuller view of where most of our operations take place.
That's awesome. So I know we've spoken quite a bit both about the differences between Canadian and American whiskey, and we've taken up almost a full hour on that. I do invite anyone to, if anyone has any questions about rye production. I have a couple myself, actually. You spoke a little bit before about the end of Maryland and Pennsylvania and Monongahela Ryes. I think I pronounced that correctly.
Monongahela.
Monongahela. What happened to those style of ryes, and how are they so different than the ryes that are coming out of Kentucky and Indiana and Tennessee afterwards?
There's a couple of things. I'll try and make it brief. Is one, I think there's something very relatable from a grain standpoint from where our rye comes from. I didn't mention, I should have. 100% of our rye is coming from the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. It's closer to Canada than it is to New York City. So similar terms of topography, climate, etc. From a Maryland, Pennsylvania, mid-Atlantic, if you will, regional style of rye, one, the ryes were not necessarily over the top, 95, 100% rye, but it's also a much grassier grain. And you could relate that to Kentucky and Indiana as well. I have not tasted rye. I've done some research on ryes that, not just from MGP, but ryes that were born of Indiana, even all the way through the upper Midwest to Wyoming, that I would imagine in much colder climate would mimic qualities of Canadian grown rye or upstate New York grown rye. The ryes that I've worked with from friends who are farmers in Maryland in particular, to me are much grassier. And I do have some examples of rye whiskey, particularly from Baltimore, produced of Maryland rye grain. And it's hard to say because it's not just one factor. Even how the barrels, the wood for the staves was seasoned 100, 130 years ago is different than the way it's done now. I don't think it was done as long, seasoned as long as it is now. So in my mind, it has a grassier note to it than the rye whiskeys that we're drinking today.
Yeah, that's it's an awesome tasting note, and we talked a little bit about barrel the differences between Canadian and American ryes when it came to laws for barrel aging. Dale's chipping in here, and he's wanting to know if you've experimented with any used barrel finishing. And Mitty, maybe you can jump in too and talk about some of the things that you guys are doing with different barrel finishes as well, and how that affects your guys' Canadian whiskey.
Alan, you want to?
Sure. So I've always been hesitant on a very personal note because I found, and to each their own, of course, I've found that a lot of the examples, particularly of American whiskey that have had secondary barrel finishes, have been consumed by the flavor, by the rum cask, by the port or the sauterne cask, and so forth. I think for me anyway, it's a very delicate balance. That being said, I didn't want to repeat something that had been done. And so the one regular output that we do at New York Distilling Companies, we take ragtime rye, finished ragtime rye, and we put them in once used Applejack barrels. And cool. It's also a 4-year aged Applejack. And to me, it just gives a real subtle note on the aroma and the palate that frankly gave me a surprise too. It wasn't just the bright red apple note that does come off, sort of a sweetness of of a very ripe red apple, but also of a little bit of hazelnut as well. And so it was fun, but I try not to distract too much from the whiskey. So it's a relatively quick few months in the secondary barrel finish. And the most important thing for us is what time of year we do the second fill. If it's in the fall, it might go a little bit longer. If it's in the spring or summer, it's a pretty quick, take it in, take it out.
Yeah, Dave, what are your thoughts?
We have been playing around. I hear exactly what Alan's saying. But Dawn, the last couple of years, like with Canadian whiskey, you know, it's everything being blended. We've got the story of blending with Gooderham and Worts being a 4-grain. You've got the story of grain with Lot 40 being 100% rye and the way it's distilled. But then you have our other whiskey, Pike Creek, where we are starting to experiment quite a bit. Don's got a few things laying down. He's got Pike Creek, 21-year-old Oloroso finish this year, works great. He's done the Speyside casks. The new Lot 40 cask strength we're going to auction off is finished in new French oak instead of new American oak. And that adds different characteristics to the whiskey. It's pretty cool in our warehouses. It's a unique area. It gets down to minus 40 degrees Celsius in the winter times, which is where Fahrenheit equals minus 40. I think when Dale was there, it was pretty cold actually a couple of years ago, if I remember correctly. But then right now it's 35 degrees Celsius, which is what, 98 Fahrenheit? And it's all non-temperature controlled. So when we'll regauge our whiskeys, production purposes only, it stays 100 days. So if you've got this straight rye whiskey going into the new French oak after the new American oak, it's 100 days. If you've got the corn whiskey going into the Oloroso sherry casks, it's 100 days. And as Dawn has told me, after about 60 days, you're not getting anything else from the barrel. So the 100 days is for production purposes.
Yeah, and I was just going on that, like there's so much diversity that happens at Hiram Walker. I know you have a slide that actually shows some of the differences between Canadian American whiskey, and it'd be cool to bring that up, just because there's a little note. And one thing that we didn't really talk about too much, and I know we're running up against it, and stay tuned, we are going to give away a couple epic bottles here, is distillation and the different distillation styles. Now, Alan, I don't know how much research that you did back into looking at American distilling history and the decisions that you made. I've always been really interested in the whole three-chamber rye, or the three-chamber still, pardon me, that was really predominant through the 1800s. And I know that was kind of lost as a, you know, over time, you know, to more efficient ways. But it does seem like that there's so much of the flavor is affected by the distillation itself. Dave, can you both of you possibly talk about how the stills themselves are shaping the rye whiskey or the flavor of the rye whiskey, and if there's any sort of specific differences?
Yeah, of course. I mean, with Canadian whiskey, as I was saying, it's where everything's kept separate and we can distill essentially any way we want. You'll see here distillation. We column distill once, we double column distill, we column and then pot distill. So essentially with the one pass through the column still will leave you a heavy whiskey at 70 ABV, and you've got your fruity, floral, green grass, soapy characteristics to it. For instance, that's how Lot 40 will start off. And then we will finish it with a pot still for a 12-hour period in an 8,000 liter still. And with that, the heads, the tails, sorry, the heads, the hearts, the tails, Dr. Dawn for this specific whiskey for Lot 40 discards of the heads and the tails. And that's essentially getting rid of the green grass and the soapy characteristics, which is fine, but for this particular expression of whiskey, he likes it this way. You've got your fruity floral notes, your baking spices for the rye. That's kind of a lot 40 way. But Canadian whiskey is generally double column distilled. When you'll hear people refer to Canadian whiskey as very light and it's a Mexican whiskey. Most Canadian whiskey is majority corn with a little pinch of rye. And that corn is double column distilled. The one run to the first column, second run takes away a lot of the big flavors from the grain and the yeast and leaves a light base whiskey. And then you'll take a once column distilled rye and blend in usually under 5%. And that's your average Canadian whiskey. Lot 40, we concentrate up all the rye with notes being 100% rye grain.
Alan, how about you? When you were concepting Ragtime Rye, what were you thinking about when it came to the shape of the still itself and how that affects the flavor of the rye?
Well, Dave did allude, rightfully so, that for us as a new company, knowing that we would be setting off and incurring debts on the backs of others pretty quickly, that we make gins and rye whiskeys. So we needed a still of some versatility. So we really looked at what was most important in my mind was simply purchasing the largest kettle we could afford. And so our kit of a 3,000 liter mash bill, 3,000 liter fermenters, the 1,000 liter kettle with a related 5-plate column, a big hot water heater, and a few rolling tanks. At the time, whenever we put the first check down 10, 11 years ago, was $260,000. May sound like a lot, may sound like a little. I didn't think it was that bad for what we were trying to do and what we thought we could produce on it. So it was really about size capacity out of a belief on my end that for gin and rye, that the larger the kettle, if you're going to pot distill something, the smoother the finished distillate. That's really oversimplifying things without any sort of scientific part of the conversation, but that really is what it boiled down to at the time. And then we have an onion head on the top because we knew it could be as versatile as possible. We could make anything except vodka really on that still.
That's awesome, Dave. I know there's one more slide that you have there, and it's Dr. Don's flavor wheel, which is always great. We always like to show that. And then I know there's some notes that you have about some of the other things that Hiram Walker makes. One last question I have, and I don't know, please by all means, if anyone has any questions, by all means to jump in. I noticed that can you explain the fermentation differences between Canadian and American whiskey? I know we talked about that briefly, Dave. The difference between endogenous and exogenous fermentation, and how fermentation contributes to flavor, and how during the fermentation process and the introduction to yeast is actually how we're getting so much of the flavor into ryes.
Yeah, I mean, this is where Don, or I think Gina's watching too. The exogenous enzymes are natural proteins, from my understanding. I mean, we still do use some malted barley a little bit. The original Lot 40 recipe from the 90s had malted barley. When Don took over as master blender, he took out the malted barley and started using the enzymes, essentially because the rye mash tends to foam due to lack of oil content in the grain. And we add the glucanase enzyme to the fermentation, which thins out the mash. Rye has lots of glucanines, which is a type of sugar. That makes it sticky, and the glucanase breaks down glucans and reduces the viscosity of the mash.
Alan, what kind of tricks do you do during your fermentation process to keep that foaming down, or do you even need to do that, and how much?
We don't. We try not to fill the fermenters too high.
Oh, well, that works. Yeah.
Which we've done before, but I will say, to the credit of Canadian rye distillers and American rye distillers, yes, it can get very foamy and it's very sticky, but it was always a turnoff for me to listen to distilleries in other parts of our country to remain nameless, that rye whiskey was so challenging to distill and to create, because we all have power hoses. At the end of the day, we can wash it all down. But for us, I recognize those effects greatly. If a mash tun for us is 3,000 liters, we probably don't fill it much past 2,600 because it will foam up. Fair enough.
What's next for rye whiskey in the U.S. and in Canada? I know, Dave, you've I don't know if you want to show the other products that you have on the go and the diversity in the range. I've read some stuff about using different strains of rye, and I'm curious how much room there is for public understanding for how the differences within the rye grain itself. And I think that it's pretty pioneering, some of the stuff that yourself and Dr. Don are doing. Do you think that's part of a better way for us to wrap our heads around Canadian rye production? And do you think that's going to be a big part of the future? And then conversely, I'll ask Alan the same thing. Where do you see things going with all these independent rye distilleries? Do you think there's a terroir style and there's going to be more similar things like empire style rye that help define the category?
Great questions. Again, this would be awesome if Dr. Don was here. Yeah. I know he is. He's got some certain strains of rye laying down right now. He's experimenting with some ones up. I know he feels that the grain itself, as Alan kind of said earlier, it's like, I don't think you're going to see Dr. Don putting out a whole bunch of new different barrel finishes in the future. He will, but I think he's starting to focus on different types of grain right now. And then maybe even, I mean, we've joked about it at the distillery, how there's 3 different pot stills and how cool it might be to make lot 40 the exact same way, but just in the different pot stills and see what would happen. As far as future goes, I'm missing, not next month, the month after. One of my favorite shows I go to is the Whiskey Fest in London, UK. I think I've been there the last 5 years running, and I think it's one of the greatest whiskey shows in the UK and Europe I go to. And it's been interesting. 5 years ago, I think lot 40 was the only Canadian whiskey there. And I think there were 2 brands from America. So 3 North American brands at this massive whiskey show. And no ryes. Like lot 40 was the only rye, and then there was bourbon. Last year, I lost count of how many European ryes booths were there. Like rye, I don't have to tell you guys, rye's exploding. And to sit and try all the different ryes, going through Canada, US, there's currently Davin and Blair's new book. I believe there's 279 distilleries in Canada now, which is mind-blowing. And I think most of them are working on Canadian whiskeys, if not rye. So I think in Canada, in the next, let's say 3 years minimum, you're going to see some really interesting expressions come out from different parts around the country and different whiskey makers.
Alan, what are your thoughts here?
I mean,
is there a way to embrace regionality around rye? Is that a better way?
It's hard to separate the question from the time that we're in now. Part of this will depend at scales like mine, who comes out of this alive. And if we just take it back 5 months and look at it from that vantage point, then I really think regional differentiations are absolutely part of a future story, and small scale or antique varieties of grain. When we do this in Toronto, I'll definitely bring a live visual, and I'll just try and do it here, based on separation of my fingers. Traditional, European, hardy German varieties of rye, the head of the rye is that long. We've got a hybrid that we work with that's about that long. And then there are antique varieties of rye where the head is just between my 2 fingers. And that's where a lot of these differentiations of flavors, I think, can come from, certainly with other influences of fermentation, obviously aging, types and size of barrels, but first and foremost from the grains themselves. Having had some interesting rye, yes, from Germany, from Scandinavia, what they're aging the whiskeys in, but I do think that not just the point of interest from a methodology standpoint, but also frankly from a marketing standpoint, may also come from the sensibility around creating opportunities for heritage varieties of rye. You've got to find them, and you've got to propagate them. I can tell you quickly, and John knows this story, that we've been working on a rye project for 10 years, since before we incorporated as a business. And we were essentially gifted from Cornell University. It reminds me back in the day when we actually got tipped out after a bar shift with a little manila envelope with cash inside. We don't get those anymore, but we got one of those manila envelopes with 10 seeds. And we had to do all the development ourselves. That's it. You get 10. It's from a seed bank. So even at our scale, we need 1 million seeds per acre. So it took 5 years of just growing, replanting, harvesting, replanting, growing again, of just that repetitive cycle of 5 years just to start having enough so that we could start harvesting, mashing, and distilling. Now we have about a 40, 45 acre perpetual rotation of just this unique variety of Horton rye, a rye that dates back perhaps as early as the late 17th century in New York State.
Yeah, and it goes to show it when a category when it stops, it's so hard to restart, and it has to be completely redefined. There's time for one more question. I'll leave it for Dale. We didn't really talk about cocktails that much, and Dale wants to know, does rye have another one or more strong spirits that you prefer in cocktails to pair with? And he says, he uses the example that cognac and rum pair so well together in cocktails, and possibly something for the history books too. I don't know if there's something that historically rye was always paired with as well in terms of another base spirit.
I'll just go from it's an interesting question, because from an American rye whiskey standpoint, you've got such a range of mash bills. If you take a predominantly Kentucky-focused rye at 50, 51, 52% rye, it's a much softer rye whiskey that you probably could pair with something like cognac or other European whiskeys, where I find the ryes that are like our 75% or the 95% ryes, it will stand up to some sweetness from rum as well. I think a lot of these aged spirits pair nicely, depending on what the drink is, of course, but the mash bill for me is an interesting place to start, because there is such a range across the board of, again, not just American, but Canadian ryes too.
Oops, there we go. Dave, how about yourself? Do you find Canadian ryes, or at least Lot 40, because we're talking about it today, pairs well with any sort of specific spirit in terms of cocktails?
To kind of add to what Alan said, like I've been sitting in my kitchen and in front of my computer for the last 5 months, so I've had a lot of time to work on drink strategies, and we actually broke it down to drink strategies for each brand. For instance, if you're taking Lot 40, being 100% rye whiskey, and it's a lot bigger, it's great if you want to make a Diamondback and put it with some Applejack or Chartreuse, or if you're making a Manhattan, to use a bigger Cinzano or Antica. Where the JP Weiser is a little bit lighter and softer, it would be overpowered if you were to use a bigger vermouth, and it would be a lesser of a Manhattan. I would use a much lighter style, but I'm a sucker for, I'd say Vieux Carré would be one of my faves, and I just love the way cognac brandies pair with a big rye.
Awesome.
Not that I need to tell him that. He'd school me on that.
He just wanted to talk about cocktails. I don't blame him. He is king cocktails. So thank you so much. Hey, I think we should probably wrap things up. And I know there's a couple other questions here, and some of them are about distribution. Dave, can you put your email on the chat there, and maybe Alan can too, and then for any other questions. We can, everyone can follow up with Dave and Alan separately here. So let's give away some rye, shall we? Let's see who is paying attention and how attentive everybody was. So what we'll do here is give everyone a second, and whoever types in the accurate answer first onto the chat screen is going to win a couple bottles here. And so Dave, we're going to play trivia with you first. Hope everyone was paying attention. If you want to give us a question, first of all, tell us what you have that you're giving out here, and then give us a question.
Can we all see it? This is the latest version of Dr. Don's cask strength. This is his third rendition, and it's the 100% rye grain. The only difference is this is finished in French oak, where you get a little more cinnamon sweetness from it, and it's 57 ABV instead of 43, so it packs a little more of a punch. You might need a really big vermouth to make a Manhattan with that.
All right, well, give us a trivia question from your Canadian whiskey presentation or Canadian rye presentation, and let's give that ball away.
Okay. People are listening. I said this about 4 or 5 times. There's three things that I will always tell a salesperson or distributor or bartender about Lot 40. There are 3 things that are what it is. I'll give you a hint. It's the grain, how it's distilled, and what it's aged in. So if you can tell me those 3 things really quickly, I'll get this bottle to you. The grain, how it's distilled, what it's aged in.
How it's distilled and how it's aged. Are you looking at the chat screen there?
Michael, I think Michael just got it. Let me. Oh wait, hold on a sec. Somebody, I don't want to lie. Was it Alice first? She got
I think it's Alice.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, I have my chat screen on the side here.
Technically, she didn't put oak. Michael went 100% rye, pot oak. Am I wrong to say that? And I love Alice. I love Alice, but she didn't put the new oak.
Well, okay, awesome, Michael. We'll get your information afterwards. We have everyone's email, so we'll get you that bottle. We'll coordinate that with Dave.
And to be clear, it's Michael Bouchard because Michael Sarsitz. Michael Bouchard answered right after.
Brutal.
Michael Sarsens. We will, if that's how we say your last name. Apologies if it's not. We'll get in touch with you.
So one awesome thing is New York Distilling Ragtime Rye is actually available in the LCBO. It took us a long time to get that done and a tremendous amount of patience, but we're really proud of it. And so that means we can also give a bottle away in Canada as well. So for those of you paying attention to Alan's presentation and conversation about American Rye, Alan, maybe you can give us a trivia question. We can give a bottle away.
Am I allowed to add a bottle to that, or is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
I'm going to add. We're launching this week a chef's series of Ragtime Rye for charitable purposes, and the first one to launch, I believe it'll either be Wednesday or Thursday, is a Tom Colicchio hand-signed cask strength 6-year-old bottle of Ragtime Rye, his barrel selection. So I'll get an address from John and I'll send one to you as well. Simple question, the mash bill for Ragtime Rye. The complete mash bill.
I guess if we're giving away 2 bottles, we'll give whoever answers this first their choice, because this wasn't on actually a slide. So, Alana.
That's it.
There we go, Alana Tillman. Okay, so we'll get your information, and Alana, maybe you can tell us whether you want the chef series or the standard Ragtime Rye. And then Alan, go ahead and give us a second question here. One more.
How old was I when I had my first Manhattan?
Oh my goodness. No one's going to remember that. That was an hour ago.
Oh, Ryan.
Oh,
Ryan got it. There you go.
Awesome. Perfect. Yeah, that's how old I was too, right? Cool. Well, hey, thank you everyone for joining. That was awesome. I hope that we get to do this again with props and different, a little more interactive, possibly at Toronto Cocktail Conference next year. And actually, Toronto Cocktail Conference just announced their online programming as well. I'm not sure if Justin and Josh are still around, but definitely go check them out. There's lots of cool programming. Evan, you want to drop in real quick and let us know what's happening for next month before we sign off here?
Yeah, next month I think we're going to do something with my good friend Jess Babin, who is the GM at Halifax's Bar Kismet. And she's also recently started a seminar series called Women in Hospitality, where she highlights women in the industry. So far, it's been a live panel series with everyone kind of been Halifax based. So we're getting together this month, and because of the way things are here right now at this very moment, it looks like we might be able to do a live event again. We'll still simulcast it onto Zoom or Facebook or however we can do it, but it does look like that we'll get something together where we can do a little panel series live in Halifax. So I'm excited for that. So stay tuned to our social channels or our website, or if you're signed up for a newsletter, stay tuned for that info too. Yeah,
awesome. Thank you. And definitely go check out the charities that Spirited Sessions donates to. You can find that information on their feeds, and they do a lot of stuff in terms of workplace training as well. And I think it's really important to be having these conversations. We're really, really happy that we were able to raise some money as well. And we thank our friends from Corby. And thank you so much, Alan, for your time today. And Dave, really appreciate you coming on and nerding out on Rye with us. And I know there was a lot to cover, but it was great to learn how diverse and how different the category is and what's going to happen in the future. And hopefully we can do another one of these again soon.
I hope so, and I hope I see all of you for a drink face-to-face soon enough. Thanks, Alan, for being part of this. Thanks.
Likewise. Cheers.
Evan, John. Hi, Michelle.
Take care, everybody. Cheers. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.